Yeah, so we've covered a lot of ground today. You've heard a lot from different users about their initial experiences in Earth Engine. And in today's session on Learn a Skill, what I'll be covering is exports. So initially, give me a second. So this is a little bit on what the content of today's presentation will be. So we have many different ways in which we can export data from Earth Engine.
Hey, Craig.
Sorry, yeah.
Screen not shared yet, by the way.
Oh, sorry, my bad. Yeah, thanks for that, Pradeep. So you can see my screen now, I guess.
Yes, thanks.
Yeah. So this content is in the slides that we've shared for today's presentation, and I've also put in a link to the repository where at the bottom where you can go and check out each of these scripts later at your own time. Uh, so yeah, so there are different ways in which you can export data out of Earth Engine. You can export images, tables, map tiles. You can export videos. Um, there's a it would obviously be a lot of ground to cover, but in today's session we'll be covering just a few of the basics. So images, exporting them to Drive and exporting them to assets, and similarly tables, which could be any of CSV, GeoJSON, KML, Shape, etc. Exporting them also to Drive or to Asset. We won't be covering anything about TensorFlow records. That's just in there as a note. Earth Engine also does have exports to map tiles. So if you generally want to create your own web applications, export to map tiles is also possible, but that's a little more advanced content that we won't cover today. And similarly, videos for if you're into storytelling and you want to display your results and share it with a wider audience, not a wider audience who don't use Earth Engine and who just want the main insights and who want to understand in a very visual way what your analysis says. You can show them videos too. So yeah, so limiting it just to images and tables. So I'll ask the question about why. So in certain case, why you might want to export your data. So despite the fact that Earth Engine has a broad range of capabilities, at the end of the day, each one of us still has a suite of tools that we use for our different analyses, and it isn't always possible to immediately switch over from tools that we're very familiar with to a new platform. So in some cases, you may want to export your data. So take images, for example. You can export images to your Drive, and you might want to do that if you want to take it to another platform where you're more familiar, maybe a desktop GIS software, maybe one of the Sentinel toolboxes, anything of that sort. And also, if you're sharing some of those some of that imagery with users who are not Earth Engine users, but also if you want to do some analysis which is not possible yet in Earth Engine, you can also export images to your Drive. And the thing to keep in mind here is that you have 15 gigabytes, which is your Drive storage, and that storage is used up with any imagery that you may export to your Drive. 15 gigabytes is obviously not a whole lot. So that's when you might want to also consider exporting to assets. So assets is 250 gigabytes of storage that's available to each individual user for free. in the free tier, and there are one of the limitations. So that's the pro of um, export to assets, obviously. But one of the limitations, or what you would say, is that assets can only be accessed within the code editor. So essentially, but the one of the main advantages there is that you can really take advantage by sharing images between scripts when you export to assets. So for example, if you create a land use classification like Soumya and Raja talked about, those classifications can then be exported as assets and then used again in another script as a base layer without needing to run the entire classification again for within that new script. Similarly, tables, you may want to export your results to CSV or GeoJSON to take elsewhere to chart or analyze. Of course, Earth Engine does have a lot of charting capabilities, which Pradeep covered in one of our last webinar sessions in detail. So I would encourage you to check out that as well. But if you do want to export your results as CSV or GeoJSON, that's possible too. You can also export your data as spatial data as shapefiles or KMLs. And similarly, you can export your tables also to assets with the same advantages and limitations that I mentioned for images. So taking a quick example. So this is a quick example. So these are all scripts that I've put into that repository link that I shared earlier. The example on the left is a basic example of exporting a Landsat and auto image to your Google Drive. The parameters that you need to specify aren't many. It's just your prepared image, in this case, a single Landsat image over your area of interest. Um, and this image is of the delta region of the Ganga in West Bengal. So you can specify which drive folder you want to export it to. You can specify dimensions of the image if your if your region or if your geometry of export is I mean, if the dimensions that you want to export to are different from the dimensions of the geometry, then of course the geometry itself or the region itself is something that's necessary. This is something to be kept in mind because if you don't specify a geometry, the default geometry is your entire uh, viewport that your browser is open to. So in that case, if your browser is open to a low zoom level and you're seeing a huge area, a state or a country, the export will attempt to export the entire land area. So that's why specifying your geometry or region is important. Um, and of course, scale. So yeah, scale is another thing where, so the default value for scale is 1000 meters, but in this case, we want the original Landsat scale, which is 30 meters. Max pixels again restricts your export in case you accidentally attempt to export a very large area without wanting to. If some parts of your image are masked out and you only want to export a very tiny fraction of the image, you should say skip empty tiles equals true. Then again, shard size and file dimensions. If you have very large images that you're exporting um, to drive very large, and you don't want them to be split up into separate images, because Google attempts to, once your image size goes above 4 GB, images are split up into individual images. But if you don't want, if you want to play around with that and change the dimensions of your file, the dimensions meaning file size of your file, you can play around with those parameters. Similarly, on the right, what we have is an example of a export not of an auto image but a plain land use classification. So in this case, it's a single band image, and many of the parameters are pretty similar to um, your auto image. You can also export images, so land use classification images as they appear in the code editor. So in the example that I've shown you on the right, um, the classification would be exported with values such as 0 to 7. I think there are 7 individual land classes. So 0 to 7 in a single band. But if you want to export that land use classification image with the styling, with the colors that you've assigned it, you can instead export it. You can first visualize it, which makes 3 bands R, G, and B out of your land use classification. So the blue pixel, for example, in that export would in that image would be 0000FF. So that gives you so 3 different bands, and your red and green would be 0, and your blue band would be 255. But that's very similar to just in fact taking a snapshot of your image from your screen. But some people may want to do that programmatically. um, so yeah, similarly you can also export your images to assets. Now what I talked about earlier was exporting to drive. Here what we have is exporting the same land use classification to an asset. So an asset, the important thing is, can be accessed by other scripts in Earth Engine. So in this case, what I've done here is exported this image to an asset. I've given it a name and an asset ID. So when I want to access this in another script, all I have to do is import this asset ID into that script, and then that script um, can access this land use classification layer for further analysis, or as a base layer for further uh, analysis on other data. And when you export to asset, one parameter that's different, one parameter that you specify is the pyramiding policy, which essentially is at different levels of your zoom, what visualization do you want to, do you want to aggregate by the minimum of each of the pixels of the lower layer, or the median, or the maximum? So that's one thing that you can specify. So coming to exporting
Hey,
table.
Craig.
Yeah,
Craig, just a quick time check. Another 3-4 minutes, please.
yeah, I think I should be fine. Yeah,
Yeah, thanks.
thanks. So yeah, exporting tables, there are different ways in which you can do it. First, looking at CSV or GeoJSON. Say if you want to take your data elsewhere to export, to visualize. What you see on the right is just the feature collection and the properties of that feature collection. And on the left, what you see is left at the bottom, what you see is the code to export that same CSV. So what you have to specify is the feature collection um, variable name, the description of the export, the folder in which you want to export it to, the file format, and the selectors. So selectors allows you to select which of these parameters on your right that you see for this feature collection you want to export. If you want to export only selectively some of them. So in this case, you're exporting the village name, this is a feature collection of villages. So the village name, the village code, and the median NDVI. Similarly, you can also export to GeoJSON. The code is pretty similar, and in this case, you're exporting to Drive. So what you see on the right is, and instead of a feature collection, an image collection, and the properties of each image in that collection. So if you want to export um, those properties, what all you have to do is specify on the bottom left file format, GeoJSON, and the selectors, which are what of the properties you want to export. So Another point here is just a random thing that I came across is that the Sentinel-2 surface reflectance imagery is now available in Earth Engine. So this little code snippet uh, takes advantage of that surface reflectance imagery. The last example that I want to cover is if you want to export your tables as shapefiles or KML. So one example from my domain that I work in, there is a data set called the JRC water occurrence data set. So wherein for each of the months from 1985 to 2015, this is a global data set. The European Union has created this data set where they have uh, 0, 1, or 2. So 1 is where there's no water, 2 is where there's water. And that water occurrence layer is available for each and every month for 30 years. So in this case, what I've done is I've clipped out a single image and or a fraction of an image, clipped it to a particular geometry, taken a focal max just because you don't want to you want to restrict the number of individual stray pixels. And I've taken that same image for October and for the months of October and May. So actually two images, yeah. So what you see in the GIF on the right is the larger surface area is October, the smaller is May. And what I've done is converted each of those using reduced to vectors that you see in the GIF at the bottom, right? So what you get is two shape files that you can, I mean, two vectors that you can export as either shapefile or KML. And the parameters are pretty simple. Collection, you specify the file name, the folder you want to export it to, and the file format. And yeah, pretty much that is what I wanted to cover. And feel free to check out the code. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to